of Edinburgh, Scotland, tucked between ancient cobblestone streets and centuries-old buildings, there is a cemetery so deeply feared that local authorities have been forced to lock its gates at night, not to keep intruders out, but to keep something in. Over 500 people have reported being physically attacked inside this cemetery, scratched, choked, bitten, and thrown to the ground by something completely invisible. Dozens have collapsed without warning. Several have been hospitalized, and at least one person reportedly lost their mind entirely after spending a single night inside a tomb. The place is called Greyfriars Kirkyard, and what lives here does not want you to leave. Edinburgh is one of the oldest cities in the world, and like most old cities, it carries centuries of darkness buried just beneath its surface. Greyfriars Kirkyard, the cemetery we're talking about, was established in 1562. It sits right in the middle of the city, surrounded by medieval stone walls, iron gates, and towering Gothic architecture. On a foggy morning, it looks like something ripped straight out of a nightmare. The cemetery has always had a reputation. Grave robbers, unmarked mass graves, torture, disease, persecution. This ground has seen it all. The soil itself, if you believe what the locals say, is soaked with centuries of human suffering. But there is one corner of this cemetery that even the bravest people refuse to enter. It's called the Covenanters' Prison, a walled-off section in the southwestern corner of the kirkyard. And inside that section sits a structure that has become one of the most feared locations on the entire planet, the Black Mausoleum, a cold, dark stone tomb, the final resting place of a man whose name is still spoken with a kind of quiet dread by Edinburgh locals, Sir George Mackenzie. To understand what haunts Greyfriars Kirkyard today, you have to go back to the 17th century. Scotland in the 1600s was a powder keg. Religion, politics, and power were colliding violently. A group of Scottish Presbyterians, known as the Covenanters, had signed a national covenant, a document that essentially declared their right to worship God on their own terms, independent of the English crown's interference. The crown did not take kindly to this, and so they sent a man to deal with the problem. His name was Sir George Mackenzie. He was the Lord Advocate of Scotland, a position of enormous legal power. He was brilliant, well-educated, and by all historical accounts, absolutely ruthless. The people of Scotland came to call him Bluety Mackenzie, and he earned that name. In 1679, following the Battle of Aird's Moss and the defeat of the Covenanter forces, roughly 1,200 men and women were marched into Edinburgh as prisoners. They had no trial, no formal charges. They were simply thrown into an open field just outside the walls of Greyfriars Kirkyard, a place that became known as Covenanters' Prison. And there they stayed through a bitterly cold Scottish winter, exposed to the elements, starved, barely clothed, denied shelter, denied mercy, denied any kind of basic human dignity. By most historical estimates, hundreds of them died right there in that field, from starvation, from exposure, from disease. Some were executed, others were tortured for information. The ones who survived were eventually shipped off as slaves to the colonies. George Mackenzie oversaw all of it. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When Mackenzie died in 1691, he was given a grand funeral. He was buried in a magnificent mausoleum right inside Greyfriars Kirkyard, a few hundred feet from the very field where those 1,200 people had suffered. He was buried, essentially, next to his victims.
and if the stories are to be believed, they never forgave him for it. For nearly 300 years after Mackenzie's death, the mausoleum sat quietly. The kirkyard read about its business as a cemetery. People visited, tourists passed through. Nothing particularly unusual was reported. Then came the night of December 21st, 1998. The homeless man, whose name has never been officially confirmed, reportedly broke into Mackenzie's mausoleum, allegedly looking for shelter from the cold. What happened next depends on who you ask. Some versions of the story say he fell through the floor of the mausoleum into a pit below, a pit that historians believe was used as a plague mass grave during Edinburgh's devastating Black Death outbreaks. Others say he simply disturbed the town. Either way, something woke up that night. Within days, reports started coming in. Visitors to the kirkyard were describing sudden bone-deep chill, not the cold of a Scottish night, but something different. Something warm. The kind of cold that settles in your chest, that makes your breath come faster, that tells every animal instinct inside you that you are not alone.
People started reporting a feeling of being watched, not casually observed but stared at, followed. Something tracking their movement through the headstones. Dogs refused to enter certain sections of the cemetery, not barking, not growling, just stopping dead, sitting down, refusing to move. Then the incidents escalated. People began reporting sudden, overwhelming nausea near the mausoleum, dizziness so severe they had to grab headstones just to keep from falling, unexplained ringing in their ears. A pressure in the air around the Black Mausoleum, like the atmosphere itself was being compressed. Tour guides started noticing that visitors would fall completely silent as they passed through the iron gate into the Covenanters' prison. Not out of reverence, out of instinct, the same way prey animals go quiet when they sense a predator nearby. Something had changed in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Something that would soon make international headlines. Let's talk about what actually happens to people here, because this is where the Greyfriars poltergeist stops being folklore and starts being something that demands an explanation. In the years following that night in December 1998, over 500 documented attacks were reported inside the kirkyard. 500. That's not a ghost story. That's a pattern. The attacks follow a specific kind of logic. They tend to cluster near the Black Mausoleum. They tend to happen suddenly, without warning, and they tend to leave marks. One of the most commonly reported experiences is the sudden sensation of being grabbed, specifically around the neck and shoulders. Visitors describe feeling invisible hands close around their throat. Not metaphorically, physically. They feel pressure. They feel their airway constrict. Some have described the sensation as identical to being choked by a human being, fingers pressing in, squeezing, and then, just as suddenly, it stops. But the marks remain, bruising around the neck and shoulders, red fingerprint-shaped marks on the skin, scratches appearing on arms and backs that weren't there before the visitor entered the cemetery. Deep scratches, the kind that draw blood. Multiple people have reportedly left Greyfriars with wounds they absolutely did not have when they walked in. In one incident that got significant media attention, a woman on a guided tour near the mausoleum suddenly cried out and doubled over. When her companions reached her, she had 5 parallel claw-like scratches running across her right cheek and jawline. She hadn't touched anything. Nobody near her had touched her. The scratches were deep enough to leave faint scars. She had no explanation. None of the people around her had any explanation. Then there are the collapses. This is perhaps the most frequently reported phenomenon at Greyfriars, and it is deeply unsettling precisely because of how consistent it is. Visitors, healthy adults, young people, people with no prior medical conditions, simply drop. Without warning, without dizziness, without any lead-up. 1 second they're standing, the next second they're on the ground and unconscious. It happens with startling regularity. Tour guides who have been leading visits to the Kirkyard for years describe it as almost routine at this point. Someone collapses near the mausoleum every few tours. Not every tour, but often enough that guides know how to handle it. They know to stay calm. They know to check for breathing. They know not to panic. But here's what's strange about these collapses. When the people wake up, they often have no memory of falling. They regain consciousness confused, disoriented, sometimes terrified, sometimes completely blank. Some have described the sensation as being suddenly yanked downward, like something grabbed them by the shoulders and slammed them into the ground. One particularly disturbing case involves a man, a skeptic, notably, who joined a tour in the early 2000s specifically to debunk the stories. He was reportedly laughing as the guide described the history of Mackenzie and the Poltergeist. He was making jokes. He was having a great time. He entered the gate into the Covenanters' prison still laughing. He made it about 20 feet before he stopped walking. His companions described him as freezing completely in place, like someone had hit a pause button. Then he made a sound, described variously as a groan, a gasp, and in one account, a whimper, and collapsed face first onto the ground. He was unconscious for several minutes. When he came to, he wasn't laughing anymore. He refused to speak about what he had experienced. He left the tour immediately. His friends reported that he wouldn't discuss it for weeks afterward, and when he finally did, all he said was, "Something touched me." Then there are the voices.
Multiple visitors and tour guides have reported hearing sounds inside the Covenanters' prison that have no identifiable source. A low, growling noise, described as less like an animal and more like a deep, resonant vibration that seems to come from underground. Whispering, not random ambient noise. Actual whispering close to the ear, sometimes describing witnesses' own names being spoken back to them. One tour guide with over a decade of experience at Greyfriars described it this way. You hear it, and your first thought is that someone nearby is talking. So you look around, and there's nobody within 20 feet of you. But the sound was right here, right next to your ear, right against the side of your head. And perhaps the most disturbing subset of incidents involves people who were not merely frightened, but who experienced something that seemed to affect them psychologically long after leaving the cemetery. Which brings us back to the homeless man, the story that circulates most often in Edinburgh's paranormal community is that the man who disturbed the mausoleum in 1998 was found wandering the streets of Edinburgh in a deeply confused and distressed state in the days following that night. Accounts vary. Some say he was incoherent. Some say he was completely silent. Some say he was speaking, but nothing he said made any sense. What most versions of the story agree on is that he was never quite right afterward. Whether that story is entirely accurate, partially exaggerated, or completely true, nobody can say for certain, but it has never been fully debunked either. and the people who live near Greyfriars Kirkyard don't dismiss it the way you might expect them to. They tend to just nod and say, "That sounds about right." If Greyfriars Kirkyard is the most haunted place in Scotland, then the Black Mausoleum is its darkest room. Let me describe it for you. The mausoleum is a stone structure, roughly the size of a large garden shed. It's built into the wall of the Covenanters' prison. The stone is dark, stained by centuries of Edinburgh rain and moss and cold. The door, when it's left accessible, is a heavy iron gate. Inside, the ceiling is low. The walls are close. The temperature, even on warm days, drops noticeably the moment you step through the entrance. Paranormal investigators who have spent time inside describe a quality of silence inside the mausoleum that is different from ordinary silence. Not the absence of sound, but a presence of quiet. Something thick and intentional about it, like the silence itself has weight. Most people who approach the mausoleum describe the same initial physical reaction, a prickling at the back of the neck, the hair on the arms standing up, a sudden, irrational desire to look behind them, even though they just came from that direction and know there's nothing there. That irrational urge doesn't go away when they look, by the way. It gets stronger. Tour groups entering the Covenanters' prison have reported that the atmosphere near the mausoleum is genuinely unlike anything they've experienced elsewhere. Even hardened skeptics, people who came specifically to not be frightened, describe feeling a low-grade dread that seems to intensify the closer they get to the stone structure. Not excitement. Not the fun kind of spookiness you get from a Halloween attraction. Something older, more fundamental. Something the body recognizes before the brain does. Some people turn back at the gate. Not all of them explain why. They just stop, look at the mausoleum, and quietly step out of the group. The ones who stay describe a variety of experiences, but the most consistent one, reported across dozens of different accounts by people who had no contact with each other beforehand, is the sensation of a presence directly behind them, standing close, breathing. Some describe feeling actual breath on the back of their neck inside the mausoleum. Warm, slow breath. Not the cold of a ghost as pop culture portrays it. Warm breath, like a living person standing 2 inches behind you. When they turn around, there is nothing there. The attacks that happen specifically inside and immediately around the mausoleum tend to be more severe than the general incidents elsewhere in the kirkyard. The choking sensations here are stronger. The bruising, when it appears, tends to be more pronounced. The collapses inside this section of the cemetery happen more frequently and often last longer. There have been multiple incidents where visitors in the mausoleum have described feeling physically grabbed and moved, not shoved, not pushed, but gripped and relocated, as if by hands that knew exactly where they were and where they wanted them to go. And in several cases over the years, the iron gate to the Covenanters' prison has reportedly swung shut and refused to open, trapping tour groups inside the walled section of the cemetery for minutes at a time, sometimes longer, with no mechanical explanation ever found for why the gate wouldn't budge. Being locked inside the Covenanters' prison at night, with the Black Mausoleum sitting right there in the darkness, is not an experience anyone seems to enjoy, not even a little. By the early 2000s, the stories from Greyfriars Kirkyard had spread well beyond Edinburgh's local paranormal community. International news outlets were covering the incidents. Television documentary crews had begun descending on the cemetery. Ghost hunting shows, travel programs, and true crime channels all made pilgrimages to the Black Mausoleum. Tour operators began organizing and documenting the official ghost tours of the Kirkyard, keeping detailed written records of incidents reported by tour participants. Names, dates, descriptions of injuries, not anecdotes passed around a pub. Written accounts, witnessed by tour guides, sometimes photographed, sometimes corroborated by multiple members of the same tour group. Those records are what gave us the 500-plus attack figure. Tour guides who have worked the Greyfriars circuit for years are matter-of-fact about the attacks in a way that is somehow more frightening than if they were dramatic about it. They describe incidents with the calm professionalism of emergency room nurses discussing routine cases. Yes, someone collapsed near the gate. Yes, a woman had scratches on her arm that weren't there before. Yes, I felt it myself. One guide described the experience of watching a grown man, tall, athletic, clearly not someone who spooked easily, walk through the gate into the Covenanters' prison and immediately begin shaking. Not shivering from cold, shaking. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists, his whole body vibrating with an effort that appeared to be about staying upright, staying present. The guide asked if he was okay. The man said nothing, just stared straight ahead at the Black Mausoleum, and then he turned around and walked back out of the gate without a word. The story of Greyfriars eventually found its way into major publications across Europe and the United States. Edinburgh's tourism industry, to its complex credit, began actively acknowledging the reputation of the Kirkyard. The ghost tours became some of the most popular tourist experiences in all of Scotland, not despite the danger, but for some visitors, specifically because of it. Now, to be fair, because no honest documentary ignores this, there are rational explanations that have been put forward. Psychologists have pointed to the phenomenon of mass hysteria and suggestion, the idea that when a group of people enter a location expecting to be frightened, their minds create the experience their expectations demand. In sufficiently charged group environments, physical sensations like dizziness, nausea, and even brief fainting can spread through a crowd like a social contagion. Environmental researchers have noted that Greyfriars Kirkyard sits on top of a network of old tunnels and vaults, and that the decomposition of organic material underground can, in certain conditions, produce infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below the range of human hearing that have been scientifically linked to feelings of unease, paranoia, the sensation of being watched, and even visual disturbances. Others have pointed to the psychological effect of the confined, dark, enclosed space of the Covenanters' prison, the high walls, the low light, the close quarters, as a naturally anxiety-inducing environment. These are not unreasonable explanations, but here is where they run into difficulty. They don't explain the scratches. They don't explain the bruising in the shape of handprints. They don't explain why multiple people in the same tour group, standing yards apart from each other, have described feeling hands on their throats at the same moment. They don't explain why a woman with no prior skin condition left the Kirkyard with 5 parallel lacerations across her face. Infrasound doesn't scratch you. Mass hysteria doesn't leave marks, and so the debate, as it always does with cases like this, arrives at an impasse, the rational and the inexplicable staring at each other across a gap that neither side has yet been able to bridge. Greyfriars Kirkyard sits right in that gap. Today, Greyfriars Kirkyard remains one of the most visited and most feared locations on the planet. The ghost tours still run almost every night. The guides still tell the story of Bluety Mackenzie, still lead groups through the Iron Gate, still stand near the Black Mausoleum and watch visitors' faces change as the atmosphere begins to press down on them. And the attacks still happen. Not every night, not to every visitor, but regularly enough, consistently enough, and with enough physical evidence left behind that the story hasn't died. If anything, it has grown. In the years since the initial wave of media attention in the early 2000s, paranormal researchers from multiple countries have conducted investigations at Greyfriars. Some have returned with nothing. Some have returned with equipment readings and audio recordings they can't fully explain. All of them, to the last, have described the Covenanters' prison as unlike any other location they've investigated. There's something about the place that gets under your skin in a way that stays with you. Former visitors who came as skeptics and left unconvinced still find themselves thinking about it years later. Not because they believe in ghosts, they'll tell you, but because of the feeling. That specific feeling inside the walls of the prison. That sense of something old, something aware, something that has had 300 years to become very, very good at making human beings afraid. Edinburgh locals, people who walk past the Kirkyard every day, who have grown up in its shadow, tend to talk about it with a kind of measured respect. They don't sensationalize it. They don't dismiss it. They simply know something is there. The way you know a neighbor has a dog by the sounds the house makes at night. You can't see it, but it knows you're out there, and it remembers. Hundreds of thousands of visitors have passed through the gates of Greyfriars Kirkyard since that night in December 1998. When a desperate man broke open a 300-year-old tomb and let something out. Most of them have left shaken, hundreds have left marked, a few have left changed in ways they still struggle to put into words. The Covenanters who died in that prison, starved, frozen, buried in unmarked ground, never received justice in their lifetimes. Perhaps they've been finding it in the century since, or perhaps George Mackenzie simply does not want to be disturbed. Either way, the Black Mausoleum still stands. The Iron Gate still swings shut on quiet nights, and somewhere in the cold Edinburgh dark, something still walks between the headstones of Greyfriars Kirkyard, waiting, watching, and if you're very unlucky, reaching out to touch you. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with a friend who loves creepy stories, and don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon, because this is just the beginning. The next story might be darker, and you won't want to miss it.